It was Christmas Eve, and 12-year-old Ethan sat alone in his small attic room, gazing out the frosted window that framed the world outside. The snow was falling in thick, swirling flakes, each one a tiny masterpiece, drifting lazily through the air, collecting in soft, silent mounds on the ground. The street below was blanketed in a heavy coat of white, and the old houses that lined the road were barely visible, their outlines softened by the thick layer of snow that had accumulated over the past few hours. The sky had long since turned a dusky purple, the kind of purple that only happens in the deep hours of winter when the sun seems to have forgotten the world entirely. Ethan's eyes traced the path of a snowflake as it gently drifted past the window, its delicate form disintegrating the moment it touched the glass. He watched it melt away into nothing, a fleeting thing, as fleeting as the moments of peace in his life. He liked the quiet of Christmas Eve, despite how lonely it sometimes felt. It gave him time to think, to let his mind wander. He didn't have many friends, and his parents were always busy with work. It seemed as though the world had forgotten about him in this tiny house on the edge of town, where the snow piled higher and higher with each passing hour. He rested his chin on his hands, elbows propped on the cool windowsill, and stared out into the dark. The world felt so still, so frozen in time. The wind outside howled as it passed through the trees, making them bend and sway, but the house itself felt suspended in a kind of eerie silence. Even the usual creaks and groans of the old building seemed to have quieted down. It was as if the house was holding its breath, as if it too was waiting for something. His parents had left earlier that evening, heading to work for their late shift. They worked at a small diner in town, a place that was always busy around the holidays, and tonight was no exception. They had promised Ethan they'd be back before midnight, but he had learned long ago not to expect too much. Promises often came and went in his household, just like the seasons. Christmas Eve should have been different. Should have been a night filled with laughter, warmth, and the smell of cinnamon and pine, but it wasn't. It was just him and the soft glow of the Christmas tree downstairs, its lights twinkling in the dark like distant stars. The tree was modest, with a few tattered ornaments and a string of lights that blinked in time with the rhythm of his own thoughts. Ethan wasn't sad about it. Not exactly. He had grown accustomed to the quiet, to the hours of being alone in his little room. Sometimes it was comforting. He could read his books, play with his toys, or lose himself in the daydreams that filled his mind. But tonight, there was something different in the air. Something that made his skin prickle with unease. It was more than just the isolation, more than the absence of his parents. It was the way the silence seemed to stretch on forever, the way it pressed in around him, heavier than usual. The kind of silence that felt unnatural, unsettling. He turned his attention back to the Christmas tree, focusing on its lights, hoping to distract himself from the feeling that was creeping over him. The soft, colorful glow was comforting, but it couldn't quite shake the tension that had started to settle in his chest. He glanced at the clock on the wall, 11:15 p.m. His parents should have been back by now. The snowstorm outside was picking up, the wind howling louder, but still, they weren't home. Ethan sighed, his breath fogging up the glass again as he leaned forward, his nose almost touching the cool window pane. There was a deep ache in his chest, an emptiness that even the tree's twinkling lights couldn't fill. That's when he heard it. At first, it was so soft, so faint, that he almost thought it was just the wind playing tricks on him. But then it came again, clearer this time. A soft, deliberate knock. 3 gentle raps on the door, followed by a moment of silence. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, his body frozen in place. He blinked, unsure if his ears were deceiving him. Was it a knock? A knock on his door? His mind raced, trying to make sense of it. His parents weren't home. Who else could it be? The only other people who lived nearby were the elderly couple down the street, and they were always tucked in by 7 p.m., well before the storm had started. No one came by this late, and certainly not during a snowstorm like this. not when the roads were nearly impassable. His eyes darted toward the door. Another knock. This time, it was louder, more insistent. The sound reverberated through the house, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It felt out of place, too sharp, too deliberate. It wasn't the usual creak of the house settling, or the random thud of something shifting in the walls. No, this was something else entirely. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the silence that followed the knock seemed to stretch out, thick and heavy. The house was utterly still. Even the wind outside had quieted, as though it too was waiting, listening. Who could it be? His mind raced, spinning with possibilities. Could it be a neighbor who had gotten lost in the storm? Maybe someone seeking shelter from the cold? But the more he thought about it, the less likely it seemed. No one had ever come knocking at this hour. And no one had ever come knocking on his door before. Another knock, this time closer, as though whoever was on the other side of the door had taken a step forward. The sound reverberated through the walls, making his pulse quicken. Ethan swallowed hard, trying to calm the rising panic in his chest. He could feel the cold air in the room, a sharp contrast to the heat that seemed to pulse from the door, as though something, or someone, was just beyond it. A sudden thought flashed through his mind. What if it was nothing? What if it was just his imagination, playing tricks on him in the darkness? But then there was another knock. A slow, deliberate sound that shattered the silence like a crack of thunder in the stillness of the house. 3 knocks, one after the other, each one louder than the last. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He stood up from the bed, his legs unsteady as he made his way to the door. His hand hovered above the doorknob, hesitant, unsure. He could hear his own breath, shallow and quick, filling the empty space around him. His thoughts raced, torn between fear and curiosity. What should he do? What could he do? The wind outside howled again, the sound of the storm growing louder, but it was drowned out by the pounding of his heart in his ears. The house felt cold now, the silence stretching thin, as if something was waiting just beyond his reach, something hidden in the shadows of the hallway. With a deep breath, Ethan slowly turned the knob, the metal cold under his fingers. The door creaked open, the sound sharp in the quiet. He stepped into the hallway, his eyes scanning the darkness. The dim light from the Christmas tree flickered from below, casting long shadows on the walls. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the heater downstairs. No footsteps, no voices, just silence. He looked down the dark hallway, his mind racing. The knock had come from the direction of the stairs, from the door at the end of the hall, the one that led to the attic. But there was no one there. No one at all. Ethan felt his pulse quicken as a wave of unease washed over him. His mind screamed at him to go back to his room, to lock the door and wait for his parents to come home. But something, a strange, unexplainable feeling, compelled him to keep walking. The hallway stretched before him, long and narrow, with the shadows of the storm outside creeping through the cracks in the windows. The door at the end of the hallway loomed like a dark presence, but no one appeared. Another knock sounded. This time, it wasn't a knock on the door. It was from somewhere deeper, somewhere farther inside the house. Ethan stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the small, perfectly wrapped gift in his hands, feeling the cold air from the storm whip past him into the house, as if urging him to make a decision. The quiet outside was suffocating, like the world itself had been silenced by the snow. His breath came in quick, shallow bursts, visible in the chill of the night. The gift in his hands felt lighter than it should have, like it contained more mystery than weight. The paper, glossy and smooth, was pristine, untouched by the harsh winds and the swirling snow outside. There wasn't a single crease or tear, nothing to suggest that it had traveled any distance, that it had even been handled before now. His fingers, stiff with cold, curled around the smooth edges of the box, and for a moment, it almost felt like the world had slowed down. The rhythmic fall of the snowflakes outside, the gusts of wind, and even his own racing thoughts seemed muted, as if everything was holding its breath, waiting for him to make his move. Ethan's eyes shifted back to the tag, and his fingers lingered there, the ink of the message dark and sharp against the delicate paper. To Ethan, open when you're alone. The words felt like a jolt to his senses. They weren't just a message. They were a command, a cryptic invitation. What did they mean? Why had someone left this for him? And why the insistence on being alone? The wind howled through the gaps in the house, rattling the windows as if it too were urging him to take the next step. But still, a sense of unease settled into his chest, as if the very air around him had turned heavier. He glanced back over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind him. Someone who had just left the gift at the door, someone who was waiting to see if he'd follow their instructions. But there was no one. The hallway behind him was empty, stretching into shadows, the faint tick-tock of the clock downstairs the only sound breaking the silence. He could almost feel the weight of the quiet pressing against him. The house was so still. His parents weren't due home for hours, and the hours before Christmas morning stretched out before him, long and lonesome. Ethan was used to being alone. He had always been somewhat of an outsider. His parents' busy work lives meant that he spent a lot of time by himself, and school wasn't much better. No friends, no real connections. But tonight, on Christmas Eve, it felt different. The silence in the house seemed more oppressive, the weight of it more unbearable than it ever had been before. His hand trembled as he reached for the door, pulling it shut behind him, sealing himself in this strange, empty world. His heart was thudding in his chest, the sound almost deafening in the silence of the night. The snow continued to fall, but now it seemed like a blanket, obscuring everything from view. The world outside was unreachable, hidden beneath a thick veil of white, and the only reality left was the small gift in his hands. Ethan stepped back into the house, carefully holding the gift, almost as though it might slip from his grasp. He turned it over, his eyes scanning the tag again, searching for some hidden meaning, some clue that would make sense of this bizarre situation. But there was nothing. Just the same simple message. Open when you're alone. He couldn't help himself. The pull of curiosity was too strong. His fingers itched to tear open the paper, to see what lay inside, but something held him back. He could hear the thudding of his heartbeat in his ears, louder now, drowning out the ticking of the clock downstairs. Was he really going to do this? Really going to open it? And what would happen if he did? The questions spun in his mind, one after another, but none of them brought him any closer to an answer. Slowly, cautiously, Ethan bent down, his knees creaking as he knelt on the cold wooden floor. He placed the gift down on the rug in front of him, the fabric soft beneath his fingers, and reached for the ribbon. The bow was perfect, an elegant tight knot that looked like it had been tied by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. He tugged on it gently, loosening the ribbon, and the small sound of it coming undone felt louder than it should have, like a signal that something had changed, something had begun. As the ribbon fell away, Ethan carefully peeled back the paper, his fingers trembling as he worked the edges free. The smooth surface of the wrapping crinkled in his hands, the paper reluctant to give way. Each rustle seemed to echo in the empty room, each movement charged with the anticipation of what was coming next. The box inside was small, no bigger than a shoebox, and yet it seemed so much heavier than it should have been. The edges were worn, scratched slightly as though it had been through something. Something old, something with history. Ethan ran his fingers over the surface of the box, feeling the rough texture of the wood beneath the thin wrapping. He could sense that this wasn't just a typical present. It wasn't just a simple Christmas gift. This was different. And whatever was inside, whatever secret it contained, had been waiting for him. With a deep breath, he lifted the lid of the box, his pulse racing in anticipation. The room around him felt colder now, the shadows deeper, as though the very air had thickened with mystery. He could hear his breathing, slow and steady, in the stillness of the room. His eyes widened as he gazed inside, at the small object resting at the bottom of the box. It was a key. But not just any key. This key was old, older than anything Ethan had ever seen. The metal was tarnished, the edges smooth from years of use, and yet it seemed to gleam faintly in the low light. It wasn't large, just small enough to fit in the palm of his hand, but there was something undeniably strange about it. The shape was intricate, unlike any key he had ever seen before, and the metal seemed to shift under the light, as though it held secrets of its own. Ethan picked it up carefully, his fingers brushing over the cool surface. The key felt heavy in his hand, as though it carried the weight of an untold story. What could it open? Why had it been left for him? The more he thought about it, the more questions piled up, one on top of another, until his mind felt dizzy with them. There were no clues, no instructions. just this single key, resting quietly in his hand. He glanced around the room, his eyes scanning the familiar surroundings, the worn carpet, the old wooden floor, the bookshelves filled with old novels and toys from years past. Nothing had changed. Nothing seemed out of place. And yet, the key in his hand felt like a turning point. Like this moment was a threshold, and the next step he took would lead him somewhere entirely new. Ethan closed his hand around the key, the cold metal biting into his palm, and stood up slowly. He wasn't sure what to do next. The house was quiet, and the snow outside had turned the world into a ghostly white blur. The gift had been left for him, but why? What was its purpose? Who had left it? And more importantly, where did this key lead? The silence in the house seemed louder now, like an invitation to uncover whatever had been hidden. Ethan's gaze returned to the key. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. Something that would pull him deeper into a mystery he wasn't sure he was ready to face. But there was no turning back now. He had opened the gift. And now, he had to see where it would lead. Ethan stood frozen, the small key still pressed tightly in his hand, as the weight of the situation began to settle over him. His pulse thudded in his ears, each beat growing louder in the silence of the house. His mind raced with questions, none of them offering any answers. Who could have sent this? The words repeated in his mind, like an echo in an empty hall, as he stared down at the gift in his hands. There was no return address, no clue as to who the mysterious person was or why they had chosen him. The crimson paper, now crinkled and slightly torn at the edges from his earlier attempts to open the gift, seemed almost too vibrant against the otherwise darkened room. The snow outside blurred the edges of the world beyond, but inside, the warm glow of the lamplight cast strange shadows that seemed to dance across the walls. The very air felt different, charged, almost as though the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to continue. Ethan gently placed the gift down on the table, feeling the smooth wood beneath his fingers as he turned it over in his hands. He wasn't sure what he was expecting. Perhaps some kind of grand gesture, a clue to explain all of this. But no. The box remained just as enigmatic as it had been when he first found it. Slowly, with a sense of reluctant curiosity, Ethan began to peel back the crimson paper, the rustling of the wrapping paper louder than he anticipated. The paper came away easily, revealing the object inside. His breath caught in his throat. It was a small wooden box, no larger than a jewelry case, but its appearance was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen before. The wood had a dark, almost ancient hue, as if it had been carved from a long-forgotten tree. The surface was smooth, but as his fingers traced its contours, he noticed something extraordinary. The swirling designs that covered the box weren't just carved, they were alive with movement. The patterns seemed to shimmer faintly, their edges blurring in the dim light, as if the box itself was breathing. Ethan blinked and rubbed his eyes, but when he looked again, the designs were still shifting, changing shape in a fluid, hypnotic pattern. He couldn't quite tell if the designs were real, or if his mind was playing tricks on him. Was it the flickering candlelight that made the patterns seem to move? Or was there something far stranger at work here? A small part of him wanted to pull away, to leave the box on the table and forget about it entirely. But the stronger part of him, his curiosity, his need for answers, pushed him forward. He leaned in closer, watching the swirling designs with a mixture of awe and unease. Each line seemed to spiral in on itself, forming intricate symbols and shapes that seemed to have no real meaning. Yet, at the same time, they felt familiar. Ethan couldn't place it, but something about the shapes tugged at the back of his mind, as though he had seen them before. Perhaps in a book. Or a dream. The box felt heavy in his hands, much heavier than it should have been for something so small. It was almost as though it was carrying the weight of centuries, secrets long buried, waiting to be uncovered. Ethan held it up to the light, studying it from every angle. The shimmer of the patterns grew brighter, almost pulsing with energy. There was no mistaking it now. Something magical, something otherworldly was at play here. And it was waiting for him to uncover it. A chill ran down Ethan's spine, not from the cold of the room, but from the unmistakable sense that this was no ordinary gift. He wasn't sure whether to be excited or terrified, but the longer he stared at the box, the more he felt a pull towards it, as though it was calling him to open it, to reveal whatever was hidden inside. With a deep breath, Ethan set the box back down on the table and traced the swirling designs with his fingertips. His mind raced with possibilities, each one more bizarre than the last. Had someone left this for him out of kindness? Or was it some twisted prank? But who would send him a gift like this, on Christmas Eve, no less, and why the secrecy? Why the cryptic message and the strange instructions to open it when he was alone? His mind swirled with confusion, but one thing was clear: whoever had sent this knew more about him than he realized. He felt an undeniable connection to the box, an urge to open it and see what lay inside, to finally understand what this was all about. The box seemed to beckon to him, almost alive in his hands, and for a brief moment, he considered waiting, putting it off until his parents returned. But then he thought of the strange message on the tag, the way it had practically demanded that he open it when he was alone. Could it be that this was meant for him and him alone? Was there something inside that could only be revealed in solitude? Ethan could feel his heart beat faster, the anticipation building like a crescendo. With trembling hands, he carefully worked at the intricate latches on the box, feeling the smooth metal press against his fingers as he opened it. The hinges creaked, and as the lid lifted, Ethan's breath caught in his throat once more. Inside the box, nestled among delicate folds of velvet, was an object so simple yet so perplexing, it took him a moment to fully comprehend what he was looking at. It was a small, perfectly round stone, no larger than a marble, but it seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of the room. Its surface was smooth and polished, and when Ethan picked it up, it felt warm to the touch, almost as though it had been recently removed from a fire. The stone was a deep shade of blue, darker than the night sky, but flecked with specks of gold that twinkled as though they were stars trapped inside the stone itself. Ethan turned the stone over in his hand, examining it from every angle, but there was no writing, no indication of what it was, or why it had been placed in the box for him. It was beautiful. It was mysterious. And for reasons Ethan couldn't explain, it felt important. Something inside him told him that this was no ordinary gift. It was a key to something much larger, something that would change everything. But what? And why him? Why now, on this quiet Christmas Eve, in the midst of a snowstorm? Ethan closed the box slowly, the stone still warm in his hand, and set it back on the table, his mind racing faster than ever before. The questions were only growing, piling on top of one another, but there were no answers. Only the stone. Only the box. Only the mystery. And as he sat there, staring at the glowing stone, he knew that this was just the beginning of something far bigger than he could ever have imagined. As Ethan's fingers brushed the cool surface of the box's lid, a soft whisper, almost inaudible, brushed against his ears. It was so faint at first, he thought he might have imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time, carrying with it an unmistakable weight. Your destiny awaits, Ethan. The words seemed to float in the air around him, like a shadowy fog that crept into his very thoughts. His breath hitched, a sudden icy chill running through him, as though the very temperature in the room had dropped several degrees. Ethan froze. His heart thudded loudly in his chest, the sound deafening in the otherwise silent room. For a split second, he couldn't move, couldn't think. The whisper had come from nowhere, had been heard by no one but him. He stared at the box in his hands, its lid still slightly ajar. His mind raced to make sense of what had just happened. Had the sound come from inside the box? Was it his imagination playing tricks on him? He couldn't explain it, but the words, "Your destiny awaits," felt more like a command than a statement. A call to something he couldn't yet comprehend, a path that was pulling him in, even though he didn't know where it would lead. With a start, Ethan dropped the box. It hit the floor with a light thud, but the sound of it seemed like a thunderclap in the tense silence that enveloped him. His hands shook as he backed away from it, his mind reeling. Destiny? He was just a 12-year-old kid in a small house, alone on Christmas Eve. Nothing about this seemed normal, nothing about this seemed real. He wanted to run, to forget about the box and its mysterious message, but something deep inside, kept him rooted to the spot. Seconds stretched into minutes as he stood there, wide-eyed, staring at the box on the floor. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a loud reminder of how completely out of control he felt. The words still echoed in his mind. Your destiny awaits. But then, against his better judgment, a small, insistent voice inside him urged him to go back. What if this was important? What if it held the answers to something bigger than he could imagine? His mind wrestled with the fear and the curiosity warring inside him, but after what felt like an eternity, Ethan's feet began to move. Slowly at first, then more quickly, drawn to the box as if it were magnetic. He knelt beside it, his fingers hesitating just above the box. His breath caught in his throat again, and for a moment, he thought he might back out. But no, he had to know what was inside. He couldn't let fear stop him now. He reached out, his fingertips brushing the edge of the box, and lifted it gently. The moment his hands touched the box, the air around him seemed to change. A strange warmth spread up his arms, the sensation like sunlight creeping through the cold of winter. He hesitated for only a moment before opening the lid fully, his heart racing in anticipation, unsure of what he might find. Inside the box, nestled carefully against a bed of black velvet, lay a single item. It was small, but it radiated an intense energy that seemed to hum in the air around it. At first glance, Ethan could barely make sense of it. It looked like an ordinary key, but there was nothing ordinary about it. The key was jet black, its metal so dark it almost seemed to absorb the light around it. The design was intricate, unlike anything Ethan had ever seen before. The shaft was slim but ornate, with strange symbols etched along the sides that swirled and twisted in a way that almost seemed to move. The handle was shaped like an abstract, twisting vine, and the teeth of the key, though delicate, were sharp and angular, almost like the fangs of an animal. Ethan picked it up gingerly, feeling a strange sense of reverence as his fingers closed around it. It was cold to the touch, but not in a way that felt uncomfortable. It was as if the key itself was waiting for him to understand its significance, as though it had been made specifically for him. The moment he held it, a new wave of questions hit him. What was this key for? Why had it been given to him? And what did the whisper mean by "your destiny awaits"? He stared at the key, his mind spinning with possibilities. It felt important, too important to be a simple trinket or a forgotten relic. Everything about it screamed of mystery, of hidden meaning. And in that moment, as he gripped the black key, Ethan felt a sense of purpose he couldn't explain, as though the key was a part of him. But there were more questions than answers. What did it unlock? What was it supposed to open? The world around him seemed to hold its breath, and the weight of the moment pressed down on him. He glanced around the room, as if expecting an answer to appear from thin air. But there was nothing. Nothing except the hum of the key in his hand, the faintest vibration, like a heartbeat. Ethan stood there for a long time, key in hand, unsure of what to do next. The cold of the room seemed to intensify, though the fire in the hearth crackled warmly nearby. The air was thick with tension, heavy with the weight of the key, the box, the whispering words. Time seemed to slow as Ethan felt the pull of the unknown drawing him forward. The key was not just a thing, it was a symbol. A symbol of something bigger, something he couldn't yet fathom. The whisper, "your destiny awaits," replayed in his mind again, and Ethan couldn't help but feel like he was standing at the edge of a vast, unknown adventure. One that was about to begin, with the turn of a key. But what would that key unlock? Ethan's gaze shifted instinctively to the end of the hallway. The familiar, mundane stretch of wood and wallpaper that had been unchanged for as long as he could remember now seemed to pulse with an unfamiliar energy. His breath caught in his throat. At the very end, where a blank, unbroken wall had always stood, there was now, impossibly, a heavy, dark wooden door. It was as if it had materialized out of nowhere, sprung into existence right before his eyes. His eyes darted back and forth, scanning for any sign of a trick, any clue that would explain how this door had appeared, but there was nothing. Just the door. And, as though to make it even more surreal, a faint, otherworldly glow emanated from the keyhole. Ethan's pulse quickened. He felt his chest tighten as the surreal sensation of the key's hum in his hand intensified. The key, he could feel it, pulling at him, urging him forward. His heart pounded harder, its thuds filling his ears as the door seemed to grow larger, more imposing with each second that passed. The wood of the door appeared to shimmer faintly in the dim light, almost as though it were alive, breathing in sync with his nervous breaths. He blinked, half expecting the door to disappear the moment he took his eyes off it. But when he looked back, it remained steadfast, unmoving in its impossible existence. A soft creak echoed through the hallway, though no one had moved. Ethan flinched, the sound making his spine stiffen with unease. His fingers tightened around the black key, the metal growing warmer with every second, as if it recognized the door, knew what was about to happen. He stood frozen, staring at the door as if it were some kind of strange, unspoken challenge. There had always been a blank wall at the end of the hall. This was impossible. And yet, there it was, daring him to approach. "This can't be real," Ethan whispered to himself, his voice shaky, the words hanging in the air like a plea. But deep down, even as the logical part of his mind screamed for him to turn back, another part, the part that had been quiet all night, the part that had felt the pull of the whisper, the key, and the unspoken promise of something more, began to grow louder. It called to him, this feeling, urging him to take the next step. He tried to convince himself to ignore it. He wanted to rationalize it, to tell himself that it was just a figment of his imagination, a product of too much stress or an overactive mind playing tricks on him. But the more he looked at the door, the more undeniable it became. There was no denying it. It was real. And so was the key in his hand, now thrumming with an energy that seemed to pulse in time with his racing heartbeat. Ethan's breath came out in shallow bursts, as though the air itself had become thick, heavy, suffocating. His legs felt like lead, but somehow he couldn't tear his eyes away from the glowing keyhole. Something, some force he couldn't explain, pulled him forward. His mind told him to run, to hide, to forget about the key, the door, and the whisper. But his body wasn't listening. It was already moving, inching closer to the door, each step a reluctant surrender to something that was beyond his understanding. The hallway seemed to stretch longer with every step he took. The walls on either side seemed to close in, pushing him toward the door as though the entire house were conspiring to lead him there. His footsteps echoed in the quiet of the house, each one louder than the last, reverberating in the empty spaces. The key, still in his hand, seemed to grow warmer with each passing second, urging him on. He felt an odd sense of inevitability, as though this moment had been waiting for him all his life, and now he had no choice but to walk through the door. He reached the threshold, standing just a few feet away from it. The air around the door was charged, electric, as if something, or someone, was waiting on the other side, just out of sight. The glowing keyhole seemed to beckon him, and before he could second-guess himself, Ethan raised the black key to the door. He could feel the key vibrate slightly in his hand, its sharp edges pressing into his palm, as if urging him to do it. His breath caught in his throat. He hesitated, feeling a mix of dread and excitement clawing at his chest. The door stood there, impossibly solid, an unyielding barrier between him and the unknown. The whisper was still fresh in his mind. "Your destiny awaits, Ethan." What did it mean? What was waiting for him behind the door? He didn't know, and that uncertainty gnawed at him. His fingers brushed against the keyhole, and a strange warmth spread through his fingertips, urging him to act. "Is this really happening?" he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible as his eyes remained fixed on the keyhole. The question seemed to linger in the air, unanswered, as if the house itself was holding its breath. His hand shook slightly as he brought the key closer to the glowing hole. The moment the cold metal touched the glowing edges of the keyhole, a jolt of energy shot through his body, as if the key and the door were suddenly alive, responding to each other. Ethan gasped, the sensation too much to bear, and instinctively he tried to pull his hand back. But it was as though the key had fused with the door, a magnetic force binding them together. He swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust. There was no going back now. The door, the key, the whisper, they had all led him to this moment. And as the key slid into the lock, Ethan felt the world around him shift. Something deep within the house seemed to stir, the walls creaking as if they too were awakening to the mystery unfolding. The door wasn't just a door anymore. It was the threshold to something far beyond anything he had ever known. And as the key clicked into place, Ethan knew, without a doubt, that nothing would ever be the same again. The whisper returned, but this time it was sharper, more distinct, as if the very air around Ethan had conspired to carry it to his ears. It wrapped around him like a cool breeze, settling deep within his chest and echoing in his mind. "Only you can unlock it." The words sent a chill down his spine, freezing him in place for a moment. He stared at the door, still breathing heavily, his heart racing against the whisper that seemed to reverberate through every corner of his thoughts. What did it mean? "Only you can unlock it." The words made no sense, and yet, they felt profoundly important. like a secret that was meant to be uncovered. His mind was spinning, caught between fear and the desperate need for answers. But as the whisper lingered, he understood something. This door, this key, this moment had all been waiting for him. It was his destiny. There was no running from it now. Ethan's fingers trembled as they grasped the black key, the cool metal seeming to pulse in his hand, urging him forward. His breath was shallow, his pulse thudding in his ears. The hallway was quiet now, eerily so. The faint hum of the wind outside seemed to have vanished, leaving only a heavy silence that pressed against his ears. The world beyond the door was calling to him, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to act. With one final glance at the key, his fingers instinctively slid it into the keyhole. The moment the metal made contact with the lock, a strange sensation rippled through him, like a current of electricity, yet so much colder. The key fit perfectly, as if it had always belonged there. He turned it. A deep, groaning creak echoed from within the door as the lock gave way, its sound reverberating through the still air like a warning. Ethan's heart leaped in his chest as the door slowly began to open. The dim light from the hallway flickered against the edges of the doorframe, casting long, haunting shadows across the walls. His fingers itched to pull away, to shut the door, to step back into the safety of the familiar. But the whispering voices, the dark pull of the unknown, kept him rooted to the spot. He couldn't turn away now. The door moved slowly, reluctantly, as though it had been sealed for a long time and was not accustomed to being disturbed. As it inched open, Ethan felt a sudden rush of cold air, the temperature in the hallway plummeting. A gust of wind swept past him, icy against his skin, carrying with it a strange, almost haunting sound. It was faint, like distant whispers, carried on the wind, faint murmurs of voices he couldn't quite make out. His breath clouded in front of him as he stepped forward, mesmerized by the sound. The door creaked wider, revealing what lay beyond. A spiraling staircase descended into utter darkness, its steps disappearing into the unknown. The wood beneath the staircase appeared ancient, worn by time and unseen hands, yet still sturdy enough to hold its ground. The staircase itself seemed to stretch endlessly downward, swallowed by the blackness that seemed to reach up from the depths, pulling the very light from the hallway into its abyss. The walls of the staircase were carved with symbols Ethan couldn't understand, twisting and winding around the walls like ancient, forgotten runes. Their meaning was lost to time, but their presence seemed to pulse with a strange, unsettling energy. Ethan felt his breath catch in his throat as a shiver ran down his spine. The cold air intensified, sending goosebumps rippling across his skin. It was not just cold, it was a deep, bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep into his very bones, like the touch of something far older than the house itself. The faint, eerie voices that had been carried on the wind grew louder, their murmurs indistinct but somehow familiar. It was as though they were calling to him, beckoning him to take the first step, to descend into the unknown. Their voices carried an undertone of both warning and invitation. Only you can unlock it. The words from the whisper echoed in his mind once more, sending another jolt through his body. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. He didn't know what he was about to face, but one thing was certain, there was no turning back. Whatever had been set in motion the moment he touched the key was unstoppable. He hesitated, standing on the threshold of the door, gazing into the dark void before him. The wind howled past him, pulling at his hair and the edges of his clothes. Every instinct told him to retreat, to shut the door and forget this ever happened. But another part of him, the part that had felt the strange pull, the part that had heard the whispers, knew he couldn't walk away. Not now. Taking a deep breath, Ethan stepped forward, his footfall tentative as he placed it on the first step. The wood beneath his feet creaked ominously, as if the staircase itself was waking up, reacting to his touch. He took another step, then another, the dark abyss swallowing him up as he descended into the unknown. With every step, the air grew colder, the whispers clearer, as though someone was waiting for him. Each breath seemed harder to take, the air thick with mystery and dread. The deeper he went, the more the sounds of the house faded away, until only the strange, echoing whispers remained, carrying secrets he was desperate to understand. Your destiny awaits, Ethan. The words whispered in his mind again, clearer this time, more insistent. The voice that had once been distant was now right beside him, pressing against his ear like a breath in the dark. Ethan's grip tightened on the railing as the staircase spiraled downward, seemingly endless, stretching out before him like a path that only he could walk. He didn't know what he was walking toward. But as the darkness consumed him, he knew one thing for sure. He had unlocked something far greater than he could ever have imagined. As Ethan carefully descended the spiraling staircase, his footsteps muffled by the dense silence, something began to shift. The further he went, the more the cold that had once clung to him receded, replaced by an unexpected warmth. The air around him, thick and heavy with anticipation, felt almost alive. It wasn't the warmth of sunlight, but something deeper, an ancient primal heat that seemed to radiate from the very earth beneath his feet. The darkness that had swallowed him up started to dissolve, like mist evaporating at dawn. The once oppressive blackness around him began to lift, revealing a scene that defied logic, a world he couldn't have imagined, no matter how hard he tried. As he reached the final step, Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Before him spread an ethereal forest, unlike anything he had ever seen in his life. The trees were tall and shimmering, their trunks carved from solid crystal, glowing softly in hues of blue, purple, and silver, like the reflection of starlight in a quiet lake. The branches swayed gently, though there was no breeze. The leaves, like delicate shards of glass, caught the dim light, flickering with an inner brilliance that seemed to come from within the trees themselves, casting rainbows across the ground. The air was thick with a strange, sweet fragrance, like a mixture of jasmine and honey, but with an otherworldly quality that made Ethan feel as though he were in a dream. Above him, the sky stretched out in an endless expanse of swirling golds and pinks, as though the stars themselves were blending with the clouds. It wasn't the sky he knew. It wasn't even the world he knew. It felt as if he had crossed into another dimension, one untouched by time or reality. The ground beneath him was soft, like moss, but as he stepped forward, the path revealed itself, made not of dirt or stone, but of streams of shimmering, liquid gold, flowing gently through the forest like rivers of light. The streams wound their way around the trees, sparkling and dancing in the soft light, leaving a trail of glimmering dust in their wake. Ethan's feet barely made a sound as he walked, the soft glow from the streams casting an ethereal light over his surroundings. But despite the beauty of the place, a nagging unease settled in his chest. There was something off. The beauty of the forest felt too perfect, too flawless, as if it were an illusion. Ethan's eyes scanned the surroundings, searching for signs of life, but there was none. No birds, no insects, no animals. Not a single rustle of leaves or chirp of distant wildlife. The silence was deafening, oppressive. Even the air, though warm, felt still, as if time itself had paused in this place. Ethan's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He was certain this wasn't real. This was impossible. This was... Who's there? Ethan called out, his voice echoing into the stillness. It bounced off the crystalline trees, the sound reverberating in the air as though it were swallowed by the strange, unreal space around him. He waited. No answer. He tried again, louder this time, his voice trembling slightly. Hello? Anyone? His heart pounded in his chest, the sound of it almost drowning out his own words. Still, there was no response. The only sound was the soft trickling of the golden streams, the gentle hum of the air around him. Ethan stood still, his pulse racing as his eyes scanned the seemingly endless forest. The glowing trees shimmered like they were alive, but not in the way that any living thing should be. Their glow pulsed with a rhythmic energy that made his skin crawl, as if the forest itself was watching him, waiting for something. Ethan felt the weight of unseen eyes on him, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling in alarm. He was no longer alone, not in the way he had been. But there was no one here, nothing he could see. The silence grew louder, and as Ethan took another step forward, the ground beneath his feet seemed to quiver, like the forest itself was reacting to his presence. He froze, his breath caught in his throat. Was it his imagination? Was this all just a dream? The eerie quiet stretched on, amplifying his unease. His legs felt heavier now, as though the very air was growing thick, pulling at him, urging him to stay in place. But the strange pull of curiosity, and perhaps something else, compelled him to move forward, toward the deeper shadows of the forest, where the trees seemed even more impossibly tall and the light dimmer. The golden streams began to twist and turn in patterns that made no sense, flowing in circles, joining together, and then splitting apart again, as though the entire forest was a giant, pulsing circuit of energy. Ethan took another step, his feet sinking slightly into the soft, moss-like ground. As he did, the faintest whisper reached his ears, a sound so soft, so distant, that he almost convinced himself it was a trick of the wind. But no, it was there again, clear as day, though too faint to make out. He held his breath, straining to listen. The whisper grew louder, and though he couldn't understand the words, the tone was unmistakable. It was familiar, soft, coaxing, as if beckoning him toward something just out of sight. Something just beyond his reach. "Who's there?" Ethan asked again, this time his voice cracking with uncertainty. The forest, impossibly, seemed to hold its breath. The golden streams, the glowing trees, the soft wind, all of it seemed to pause, waiting. Then, without warning, the faint rustling began again, a gentle rustle among the crystal leaves above him, followed by a deeper, distant murmur, like voices from far away. He wasn't alone. Ethan could feel it now. Something was watching him from within the depths of the forest. And the worst part? He had no idea what it was. Suddenly, from the corner of his eye, Ethan caught a faint movement. Something shifting in the shadows of the glowing forest. He froze, heart hammering in his chest as the air around him seemed to grow heavier. The stillness of the place made it almost impossible to tell whether he was imagining things or if something was truly moving toward him. His senses were on high alert, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling with an almost tangible tension. Then, through the misty haze between the shimmering trees, a figure slowly emerged. At first, it was just a shape, a shadowy outline against the backdrop of glowing foliage, moving silently as though it was part of the forest itself. But as it came closer, the shape solidified into a boy, roughly Ethan's age, with a strange presence about him. His clothes were old-fashioned, worn, faded, and out of place against the surreal glow of the crystal trees. His shirt was of rough linen, untucked, with suspenders hanging loosely by his sides. His trousers were too long, the cuffs slightly frayed at the bottom, as if they had been sewn and mended many times over the years. Despite the boy's age, the clothes looked ancient, as though they belonged to a time long before Ethan was born. The boy's face was pale, almost ghostly, as if he had never seen the warmth of the sun. His skin was so fair it almost seemed translucent, and his hair, pale, wispy, and wild, cascaded around his face in a way that made it seem like he was barely a part of the physical world. But it was his eyes that captured Ethan's attention the most. They were as pale as moonlight, almost glowing in the dim light of the forest. There was something unervingly vacant about them, as if they didn't truly belong to the boy but were borrowed from some faraway place. They seemed to flicker with a light that wasn't of this world, as if they were windows into something vast and unknowable. For a moment, the boy simply stared at Ethan, his gaze steady and unblinking, as if weighing something in his mind, something that Ethan couldn't quite understand. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. The boy's lips trembled slightly, his eyes darting around the glowing forest as though he feared something unseen. Then, as if he had finally decided to speak, the boy's voice broke the silence. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. His tone was laced with fear, but not for himself. It was a warning, a deep, unshakable warning, as though his presence in this place, this strange, glowing forest, could have dire consequences. His words carried an undertone of urgency, a trembling conviction, like someone who had seen something terrifying and now wanted to protect whoever would listen. Ethan stood frozen, his mind racing to process everything he was seeing. The boy's words echoed in his ears, but the meaning of them felt elusive, like a puzzle missing its final piece. "I didn't mean to come," Ethan found himself saying, almost instinctively, his voice shaking as if the weight of the situation had finally begun to sink in. "The box, the key. It brought me here." As the words left his lips, the boy's expression softened for just a moment, a fleeting glimpse of something resembling pity, or perhaps empathy, crossing his face. But it was quickly replaced by the same fear that had laced his voice. The boy stepped forward, closing the distance between them with a strange kind of fluidity, moving as if he had been here for an eternity, as if the land itself was familiar to him in a way that Ethan couldn't begin to understand. His feet barely made a sound on the soft, mossy ground, his movements graceful and eerily calm, as though he wasn't entirely bound by the rules of this world. Ethan's chest tightened as the boy reached out with one pale hand, as if to touch him, but then stopped mid-motion. His fingers hovered just inches from Ethan's arm, a look of fear clouding his already haunted expression. "You shouldn't have come," the boy repeated, his voice now trembling more than before. "This place, it's not for you. Not for anyone who doesn't belong here." His words were heavy with meaning, as though they held more than just a warning. There was something deeper, something unsaid that made Ethan's pulse quicken. He could sense the boy's urgency, the palpable dread that seemed to linger in the very air between them. "I didn't choose this," Ethan said, his voice steadying with a newfound resolve. He wasn't sure why he felt so certain, but a strange feeling settled over him as he spoke. "The key. It led me here. I don't understand why, but it did." The boy's face darkened as he glanced nervously around, his body tensing. It was as if the very mention of the key had made the atmosphere shift, as though something unseen had been awakened. His lips parted to speak again, but no words came out. Instead, his gaze flickered over Ethan's shoulder, then to the forest, and then back to Ethan, as though he was searching for something. Anything that would explain the inexplicable. His mouth twisted into a tight, thin line, as though struggling to find the right words. "You shouldn't have opened it," the boy finally whispered, his voice barely audible in the dense air. "The key. It's a link. A link to something much darker. Something that has been waiting." Ethan's heart skipped a beat as the boy's cryptic words sank in, leaving him with a gnawing sense of unease. "Something darker? Something waiting? What do you mean?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling now. "What's waiting?" The boy's gaze met his once more, but it was filled with a sadness that chilled Ethan to the core. "You've opened the door to something that should have stayed closed." His voice dropped to a near whisper, "and now it's too late." The boy's expression darkened further, and the air around them seemed to grow heavier, as if the very forest itself was holding its breath. His pale eyes widened, his body trembling slightly with the weight of his own words. Ethan's heart thudded painfully in his chest, a mix of fear and confusion flooding his senses. The boy stepped back, his hand shaking as he pointed toward the heart of the glowing forest, where the trees seemed to pulse with a strange, eerie light. "Then you've been chosen," the boy whispered, his voice thick with both dread and sorrow. "The Keeper of Whispers is looking for you." The words hung in the air like a thick fog, their meaning elusive but undeniable. Ethan's mind raced, struggling to understand what he had just heard. The Keeper of Whispers? Who or what was that? The boy's tone was heavy, each syllable dripping with an unspoken terror that made Ethan's stomach churn. It wasn't just a name. It wasn't just a title. It was something dangerous, something that no one in their right mind would want to be connected to. "Who is the Keeper of Whispers?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper, as though even speaking the name aloud could bring that darkness closer. He had to know. He had to understand what was happening to him, to this place, to everything he had found himself tangled in. The boy shook his head, a deep sadness clouding his pale eyes. His lips quivered slightly, as though the answer was something too terrible to speak. He cast his gaze downward, as if ashamed, as though burdened with the knowledge of what would come next. "You're asking the wrong question," the boy murmured, his voice quivering. "The real question is, can you escape it?" Ethan's chest tightened. A cold sweat began to bead on his forehead as he tried to absorb what was happening. His mind scrambled for answers, trying to make sense of the boy's words. Escape it? How could he escape something that had already chosen him? That's when the boy's eyes flicked up, piercing him with a gaze so intense that Ethan could almost feel it burn through him. "The Keeper isn't just a thing," the boy said, his voice trembling now, as though the very act of speaking the name was an act of defiance. "It's a force. A power that whispers into your mind, into your soul. It speaks to those who have been marked, those who have opened the door, like you." The boy took a deep, shaky breath, his body trembling in a way that Ethan couldn't ignore. "Once it finds you, it doesn't let go. It doesn't stop until it gets what it wants." Ethan's heart pounded as the weight of the boy's words settled in. "What does it want?" he managed to croak, his voice thick with fear. He had never been this terrified in his life. Not even the cold chill of the snowstorm outside could compare to the icy grip of dread that seemed to creep up his spine. The boy's face twisted into an expression of deep regret, as if he had lived through this nightmare before and knew exactly what it entailed. "It wants you," he said, his voice low and full of pain. "It wants your soul, your life." Your very essence. The keeper of whispers takes what is most precious and keeps it for itself, until there's nothing left but an empty shell. Ethan felt as if the ground beneath his feet had been yanked out from under him. He stepped back, his mind reeling. This couldn't be real. It had to be a dream, a nightmare. But as he looked into the boy's eyes, filled with an ancient sorrow and terror, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. That this was no ordinary place. And he was no ordinary boy. Is there no way out? Ethan asked, his voice shaking, desperate for some kind of answer, some glimmer of hope. The boy's face darkened further, and for the first time, Ethan saw a flicker of something else in his eyes. Something that made his stomach twist. Was it pity? Or was it something worse? There is always a way out, the boy said, his voice low, almost too quiet to hear. But that way is never easy. It will cost you more than you can imagine. Ethan's thoughts raced. His mind grappled with the implications of everything he was hearing. Could he somehow escape this fate? Could he avoid becoming the keeper's next victim? He turned his gaze toward the glowing forest, its beauty now tainted by the dark presence that the boy had spoken of. How could he even begin to fight something like that? Something so ancient, so powerful, that it could manipulate time and minds with a mere whisper. The boy seemed to sense Ethan's thoughts, his expression darkening even more. If you're thinking of running, he said softly, you can't. Not from the keeper. It's already found you. And now, it will never let you go. His voice faltered, the weight of his own words crushing him. You must face it, Ethan. There is no hiding from what's coming. Ethan's legs felt weak, his body trembling as though it could barely withstand the gravity of the situation. He looked down at the key in his hand, the key that had led him here, to this place, to this nightmare. He could almost hear the faintest whispering in the back of his mind, like an insidious voice trying to worm its way into his thoughts. The boy's expression softened, a strange sadness in his eyes. The keeper will come for you, he said, his voice steadying. But if you're strong enough, if you hold on to your soul, there may still be a chance. Ethan stared at him, his heart pounding. A chance? A chance for what? To survive? To escape? Or to become something worse? But the boy was already fading into the mist of the glowing trees, his form dissolving into the shadows, leaving Ethan alone with the weight of his words, and the terrifying realization that his journey had only just begun. Before Ethan could ask what that meant, the ground beneath his feet began to tremble violently. It was subtle at first, a mere vibration, but it grew stronger with each passing second, as though the very earth was alive and reacting to some ancient force awakening beneath it. The ground seemed to pulse, rhythmic and unnerving, echoing like the beat of a monstrous heart. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the trees around him began to sway, bending in unnatural angles, their crystal branches creaking and groaning under the strain. The forest itself seemed to be reacting, alive with energy, and yet, something was terribly wrong. A cold wind swept through the glowing woods, sending an eerie chill down Ethan's spine. The shimmering streams seemed to darken as the mist that had lingered in the air thickened, swirling in unnatural spirals. It wasn't just the trees that were shifting, the very atmosphere felt as if it was folding inward, converging on something, or someone that was coming. The mist deepened, growing darker, more oppressive, and from its depths emerged a figure. It was cloaked in swirling shadows, its form shifting and distorting, as though it wasn't entirely part of the world around it. The figure moved with an unnerving grace, a gliding motion that made the ground tremble even more. Its face, obscured by the hood, was hidden in shadow, but there was an undeniable presence, a sense of ancient power radiating from it. Ethan felt it even before he saw it, the cold, suffocating energy that seemed to drain the warmth from the air. And then came the voice. It wasn't a voice at all, but the sound of 1,000 whispers, all layered on top of one another. The words were indistinguishable at first, too many to process, like a chorus of voices speaking in unison, their tones high and low, soft and jagged, all blending together into an incomprehensible murmur. It sent chills down Ethan's spine, and his heart hammered in his chest. It was the kind of voice that wasn't meant to be heard, something primal and ancient, like an omen or a curse. Ethan, the figure hissed, its voice slicing through the endless whispers, its words chilling in their clarity. You've opened the door. Now you must take your place. Ethan felt his legs go weak beneath him. The words seemed to come from everywhere at once, wrapping around him like chains, pulling him deeper into the cold grasp of whatever this figure was. His throat tightened, and he swallowed hard, trying to steady himself, but the air felt thick, suffocating, as though the very atmosphere was heavy with the weight of the figure's presence. His body trembled involuntarily. "Take my place," he managed to choke out, his voice barely audible, like a plea for answers, but the mist surrounding him seemed to swallow the words before they could even reach the figure. The boy, still standing beside Ethan, grabbed his arm with a sudden force that jolted him back to reality. His grip was firm, almost painful, but there was no time to think about it. The boy's face was pale with fear, his lips trembling as he looked desperately at Ethan. "Run!" the boy shouted, his voice rising above the whispers. There was no hesitation in his tone, only pure, unfiltered terror. His eyes were wide, almost frantic, as if the very act of standing still would be enough to doom them both. "Run, Ethan. Now!" Ethan didn't have to be told twice. The moment the boy's hand tightened around his arm, Ethan bolted forward, his feet stumbling over the uneven ground, his breath ragged in his chest. His heart was pounding so loudly he could barely hear anything else over the chaotic chorus of whispers and the thrumming sound of the earth beneath him. The trees seemed to close in on him, their crystal branches reaching out like jagged claws, as if the forest itself were trying to trap him in its embrace. The mist grew thicker, swirling around them, making it almost impossible to see where they were going. Each step they took felt as though they were plunging deeper into a nightmare that refused to end. Ethan's mind raced, but every thought was drowned out by the oppressive, suffocating presence of the figure behind them, the whispers growing louder, more insistent, as if the very air around them was filled with an overwhelming, ancient hunger. The boy beside him was pulling him faster, his own feet moving like they were in a race against time. "You can't stop running," the boy yelled over his shoulder, his voice filled with panic. "It's coming. You have to outrun it. Don't look back." Ethan felt the sharp, cold air cut through him, each breath coming in jagged gasps, but he couldn't stop. The boy's grip on his arm was a constant pull, urging him onward, dragging him through the misty forest. His legs burned from the effort, his mind a blur of confusion and fear. What was chasing them? What was that thing? Was it the Keeper of Whispers? Was this the price for opening the door? The weight of everything was pressing down on him, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not while that shadowy figure was out there. Suddenly, the ground trembled again, more violently this time, causing both Ethan and the boy to stumble. The whispers grew louder, echoing in their ears like a tidal wave crashing over them, suffocating them in sound. The boy's face twisted in terror as he dragged Ethan onward, but the air was thick with something else now, an overwhelming pressure, like the weight of 1,000 eyes watching them, waiting. Ethan risked a glance behind him. Through the mist, he saw the shadowy figure, moving faster now, its form warping in and out of the mist as if it wasn't entirely bound by the laws of reality. The whispers coalesced into a single, chilling voice that seemed to speak directly into his mind. "You can't run from your destiny, Ethan." The words were cold, taunting, and full of an unimaginable hunger. Ethan's pulse quickened. They couldn't keep running forever. There had to be another way. There had to be a way to stop this. They sprinted through the forest, their feet pounding against the soft, damp ground, the echoes of their footsteps drowned by the deafening sound of the Keeper's whispers. The air was thick with tension, each breath Ethan took feeling heavier than the last. The whispers seemed to come from all directions, curling around them like invisible vines, wrapping themselves tighter and tighter with every step. The trees, their crystal branches now bending like twisted arms, seemed to close in on them, their sharp edges gleaming ominously in the dim, otherworldly light. Ethan's heart raced. He could barely see through the fog of mist swirling around them, but he could feel the presence of the Keeper growing ever closer, its breath like a cold wind nipping at their heels. The boy beside him, though visibly terrified, moved with determination, pulling Ethan along at a pace that felt almost impossible to maintain. Every muscle in Ethan's body screamed for him to slow down, to stop, but there was no time. There could be no hesitation. If they stopped for even a moment, he feared they would never get another chance to escape. The whispers were maddening now, the words slithering into his mind, filling him with dread, as if the Keeper itself was trying to plant its thoughts in his head. He could hear fragments of phrases, distorted and broken, but each one seemed to chill him to the bone. "You can't escape. You belong to the darkness. The door is closed to you now. Ethan tried to push the voices away, focusing only on running, on staying ahead of the growing shadow. He could feel his legs burning, his body begging for rest, but the urgency in the boy's eyes pushed him onward. There was no time to think about the pain. No time to question why this was happening or how they had ended up here. There was only the goal: escape. Suddenly, the trees began to thin out, and the forest opened up before them. The ground beneath their feet shifted, becoming smoother, softer. And then, ahead of them, through the fog, a glimmer of light caught Ethan's eye. His breath hitched. They had reached the edge of the forest. As they broke through the last line of trees, Ethan found himself standing in a large open clearing. The mist seemed to part here, as though the very air recognized the significance of this place. In the center of the clearing stood an enormous, glowing mirror, its frame made of dark, intricate metalwork that seemed to shimmer and shift as though it was alive. The mirror's surface was a swirling vortex of light, constantly moving, drawing the eye in with its hypnotic glow. It felt otherworldly, as if it didn't belong in this realm at all. Ethan's eyes widened in awe and fear. "This is your way out," the boy said, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and urgency. He stood slightly in front of Ethan, his back stiff, eyes still darting nervously as though the keeper's presence was closing in on them. "But you have to make a choice." He paused, his voice barely more than a whisper now, as though the weight of the decision was heavy enough to crush them both. "Leave and forget this place forever, or stay and protect the worlds beyond the door." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The words hit him like a punch to the stomach, leaving him breathless, unsure of what to make of them. Protect the worlds beyond the door? What did that even mean? He glanced back at the forest, the trees now swaying violently as if the keeper's fury was manifesting itself in the very land around them. The air was thick with the weight of its anger, and the whispers seemed to crescendo into an overwhelming roar that threatened to drown out all other sounds. He turned back to the mirror. Its surface seemed to beckon to him, the swirling lights inside pulling at his very soul, tempting him with the promise of escape. He could leave, forget everything, and never think of this cursed place again. He could return to the life he knew, where everything was familiar, safe, and normal. But there was a price for that, wasn't there? Would he really be able to forget what he had seen here? Could he live with the knowledge that he had abandoned this world, left it vulnerable to whatever the keeper was planning? As if sensing his hesitation, the boy stepped closer, his voice low, almost pleading. "You don't have to stay," he said. "You can walk away. You can live your life without knowing the truth of this place." He paused, his eyes filled with a sadness that made Ethan's heart ache. "But if you leave, it may never be safe again. The keeper. It won't stop." Ethan's mind raced. He couldn't deny the pull of the mirror, the sense of safety it offered, the way it seemed to promise him a life free from the horrors of this twisted forest and the terrifying figure that hunted them. And yet, something inside him told him that leaving would be the easy way out, but not necessarily the right one. Could he live with himself, knowing that the fate of these worlds rested in his hands, and that by choosing to walk away, he might doom them all? The boy was still staring at him, waiting for his decision, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a choice between two paths. It was a decision that would shape not just his life, but the fate of everything that lay beyond the door. Would he be the one to stop the keeper, to protect the worlds that depended on him, or would he turn his back on them, choosing safety over responsibility? As the whispers grew louder, almost deafening, Ethan realized something. This wasn't just about him anymore. The boy beside him. He had seen what happened when the keeper's power was allowed to reign unchecked. He had felt the weight of this responsibility for much longer than Ethan had, and yet, he had never been able to make this choice himself. But now, it was Ethan's turn. The question was no longer whether he could survive in a world untouched by the keeper. It was whether he could live with himself if he didn't take action. The glow from the mirror seemed to pulse, as though waiting for his answer, as though everything was waiting for him to decide. And deep down, Ethan knew that this was his destiny. It had always been his choice to make. Ethan stood frozen, his hand still clutching the small, intricately carved box as if it were the only thing tethering him to reality. His mind was a storm of confusion and doubt, the weight of the decision bearing down on him, threatening to crush him under its intensity. The glowing mirror before him pulsed with an almost magnetic force, urging him to step forward, to take the easy path out. But the boy beside him, standing as a silent sentinel, had told him something that echoed in his mind. The keeper is coming. The air around them seemed to thicken, the once vibrant forest now cloaked in a tangible sense of danger. Every rustling leaf, every creaking branch, felt like a warning. Ethan's gaze shifted to the boy, whose pale eyes seemed to shimmer with an ancient wisdom, as though he had lived through lifetimes of fear, pain, and longing. The boy had said he had been waiting for someone like Ethan. Waiting for someone who was brave enough to question, who could see beyond the surface of things. But why him? Ethan wasn't anyone special. He was just a normal 12-year-old boy. Why me? Ethan whispered again, his voice barely audible over the whispers that swirled around them, thick and unnerving. He took a step closer to the boy, the pounding of his own heart like a drum in his chest. The boy's lips twitched into a faint smile, his gaze never wavering from Ethan. Because you're brave enough to question and kind enough to care. That's why the box found you, he answered, his voice steady, yet laden with an emotion Ethan couldn't quite place. There's something in you that makes you different from everyone else, Ethan. The keeper chose you for that very reason. Ethan's chest tightened as he processed the boy's words. It felt like he was being pulled in two directions at once. One pulling him toward the mirror and the promise of safety, of returning to the life he knew, and the other pulling him towards something greater, something unknown. The unknown terrified him, but at the same time, it called to him, urging him to step into it. Do you really think I'm brave enough? Ethan muttered, his voice breaking slightly. I don't feel brave. I feel scared. The boy's expression softened, his eyes reflecting a deep, understanding sadness. Bravery isn't about not being afraid. It's about having the courage to face your fear. To choose to do what's right, even when it seems impossible. That's what makes you different. You care. You want to make things right, even if it means stepping into the unknown. Ethan swallowed hard, the boy's words stirring something deep inside him. He thought back to the way the box had found him, to how it had appeared on his doorstep, as though it had known him before he knew it. There was a connection there, something far beyond a mere coincidence. The keeper had been searching for him, and now it seemed he had found him too. Ethan's thoughts swirled like the mist around them, and he turned his attention back to the mirror, its glow now brighter, more inviting. The world he knew, the safety of his home, his parents, his life, was just beyond that threshold. He could go back. He could forget everything. The whispers would stop. The danger would vanish. But the boy beside him, he had told him the truth. This was no ordinary choice. This was a chance to change something that had been wrong for so long. He turned back to the boy, his eyes searching the pale face before him. If I stay, what happens to you? Ethan asked, his voice trembling slightly, but carrying the weight of his decision. The boy's gaze faltered for a brief moment, as if the question caught him off guard. But then his eyes softened, his expression filled with something like relief, as though a great burden had been lifted from his shoulders. I'll be free, the boy said quietly. I've been trapped here for years, waiting for someone like you. For someone who could unlock the door, who could make the choice. The keeper. It holds me here. But if you stay, I can leave. I can finally be free. Ethan's heart tightened at the thought. This boy, this strange and mysterious figure, had been waiting all this time for someone like him to come along. And now, it seemed, the fate of both of them hung in the balance. Ethan couldn't bear the thought of leaving the boy behind, trapped in this strange, shimmering world. But how could he make the right choice? How could he know that staying was the best thing for everyone? He looked down at the box in his hands, the small, black key inside seeming to pulse with an energy of its own. He could feel it in the air around him, a heavy anticipation that was almost suffocating. The keeper's presence was undeniable now, its whispers too loud to ignore, growing more and more insistent. The shadowy figure was closing in on them, and time was slipping away. Ethan took a deep breath, his mind racing. Then I'll stay, he said, his voice suddenly firm. The words felt like a declaration, as though something deep inside him had shifted. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew with all his heart that this was the only path left to him. The boy nodded, a faint, grateful smile breaking across his face. Thank you, Ethan. You have no idea how much this means. But before Ethan could say anything more, The air around them seemed to grow darker, heavier. The ground trembled beneath their feet. The keeper's shadow loomed closer, its whispers now a cacophony of voices, each one more urgent than the last. "Decide, Ethan," the keeper's voice hissed, rising above the others. "Time is slipping away." The boy's face hardened, his eyes wide with fear. "Hurry," he cried, grabbing Ethan's arm and pulling him toward the mirror. The keeper's figure loomed just beyond the trees, its form a shifting mass of darkness, eyes gleaming like burning embers. The choice had been made. There was no going back now. As Ethan took a step forward, his heart thudding in his chest, he felt the weight of the choice he had made settle around him. The air had grown thick with anticipation, but as his foot crossed the threshold toward the keeper, something unexpected happened. The eerie whispers that had once been all-consuming began to soften. The sinister voices, which had once echoed through the forest like 1,000 invisible hands tugging at his mind, began to harmonize into a gentle melody, a soft, calming rhythm that was almost soothing. It was as if the very fabric of the forest itself was responding to his decision. The trees, once swaying violently in the throes of fear, now stood still and at peace, their crystalline leaves shimmering like stars under a soft moonlit glow. The streams that had once shimmered like liquid gold now rippled gently, their sound like a lullaby to Ethan's ears. The very ground beneath him seemed to sigh with relief, as though the weight of the darkness had lifted and left only light in its wake. Ethan's gaze turned back to the boy, whose pale eyes were filled with something Ethan couldn't quite name. The boy had been a guide, a mysterious figure who had led him to this moment, but now there was something different in his expression. Something like gratitude, like freedom, and maybe even a touch of sadness. "You did it," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible over the now peaceful forest. "You freed me, and the world's beyond the door. You made the right choice, Ethan." Ethan nodded slowly, the heaviness of the moment settling deep in his chest. He didn't know what it all meant yet, didn't fully understand the responsibility he had just inherited, but something inside him, something deep within his soul, knew that he had made the right choice. He had chosen to stay, to protect the worlds beyond the door. And in doing so, he had set things right, for both the boy and for himself. As the last of the keeper's whispers faded away, the shadow that had been so oppressive, so menacing, began to dissolve. It broke apart like smoke in the wind, fading into the glowing air of the forest. For the first time, Ethan could hear his own breath, feel his heart beating steadily in his chest. The oppressive weight of fear, doubt, and uncertainty had lifted, and in its place was a new sense of calm, of purpose. The boy, standing beside Ethan as the light from the mirror began to intensify, smiled, a smile so bright and genuine that it lit up his entire face. The last traces of his ghostly appearance seemed to evaporate, replaced by a warmth that Ethan hadn't seen before. The boy's form appeared to glow softly, as though he were no longer bound to this world, but was now free to leave, to move on, to step into whatever awaited him beyond the mirror's light. "Thank you, Ethan," the boy said, his voice full of emotion. "You'll make a great keeper." Ethan's heart skipped a beat at the words. A great keeper? He didn't understand. The boy had told him that staying meant he would protect the worlds beyond the door, but what did that mean exactly? What kind of keeper was he meant to be? The boy's eyes softened, as if reading Ethan's thoughts. "You're not alone," he said, his voice reassuring. "There are others, other keepers who will guide you, just as I have. You won't be left in the dark. But you've got the strength, Ethan. You've got the courage." The last of the boy's form began to fade, his image dissolving into the shimmering light of the mirror. Ethan could barely catch his breath, unable to stop himself from reaching out, as though trying to hold on to the boy, trying to understand the magnitude of the decision he had just made. But before he could speak, the boy's figure was gone, leaving behind only the soft melody of the forest and the faintest echo of his words. "You'll make a great keeper." Ethan stood still, the reality of the boy's departure sinking in. His heart swelled with emotion. He had not only helped free someone, but had been entrusted with something far greater than he could have imagined. The keeper's shadow had been vanquished, and now it was his turn to take its place. The mirror's light pulsed around him, and Ethan felt it, the weight of the mantle he had just taken up. He wasn't sure what lay ahead, what challenges or threats awaited him, but one thing was certain. He was no longer the same boy who had stumbled upon a mysterious box on a snowy Christmas Eve. He had changed. He had become someone stronger, someone who could face whatever lay beyond the door. With a final glance at the now tranquil forest, Ethan stepped closer to the glowing mirror. As the light enveloped him, he knew that this was only the beginning. His journey as the new keeper had only just begun. Years later, Ethan would still sit by the frosted window, watching the snow fall in soft, swirling patterns. The world outside had remained unchanged in some ways, but for Ethan, everything had transformed. The attic room, once a place of solitude and quiet longing, now felt like a sanctuary, a space where memories lived and whispered to him in the stillness of winter nights. He would gaze out into the endless white, a blanket of snow that seemed to mirror the peace that had settled inside him, a peace that he knew was hard-earned and hard-won. The snow would pile higher, as it always did on Christmas Eve, and yet, for Ethan, the passage of time had a different rhythm now. Every flake that drifted down from the sky seemed to carry a memory of the journey he had embarked upon years before. The journey that had led him to discover a world of crystal trees, glowing mirrors, and the shadows of ancient keepers. And in his hands, always close to his chest, he would hold the wooden box, its intricate carvings and swirling designs as familiar to him as the beat of his own heart. The box, which had once felt like a mysterious object of curiosity, had grown into something much more, a bridge between two worlds. A symbol of the courage he had found within himself, and the kindness that had guided him through every step of the journey. It was no longer just a box, it was a reminder of the responsibility he had taken on, and of the bond he had forged with the boy from the glowing forest, a boy who had once been lost but was now free, thanks to the choice Ethan had made. The key had unlocked not just a door in a forgotten hallway, but a door in his own soul, a door that connected him to something greater than he had ever imagined. On those quiet nights, when the world seemed to pause, and the snow fell in hushed silence, Ethan would sit by the window, feeling the weight of the box in his hands. He would trace the patterns on its surface, letting the smoothness of the wood remind him of the many choices he had made since that fateful night. He had grown, not just in age, but in wisdom. The boy had become a keeper, but Ethan had become something even more. He had become the protector of the unseen worlds beyond the door, a guardian of the delicate balance between kindness and courage, light and shadow. Sometimes, on those cold winter nights, as he held the box close, Ethan would swear he could hear the faintest of whispers. It was so soft, so faint, that at first, he thought it was just the wind or the creaking of the old house. But then, when the silence stretched long enough, he would hear it again, a whisper that seemed to come from deep within the walls of the house, from the very earth beneath his feet. A voice not his own, but familiar, echoing through time. He would lean closer to the window, his breath fogging up the glass as he listened, straining to catch the words that seemed to drift on the wind. "Thank you, Ethan." It was always the same phrase, repeated in soft, grateful tones. Sometimes, it came with a warmth, like the comforting embrace of an old friend, reminding him that the world he had chosen to protect was still there, still in need of his care. And other times, the whispers seemed to carry with them the laughter of children, the soft murmur of a hidden world where courage and kindness still mattered most. And so, year after year, Ethan would sit by that frosted window, holding the box close. He had learned that his connection to the forest, to the boy, and to the worlds beyond the door would never fade. It wasn't something he could ever forget, nor would he want to. The box had become part of him, woven into the fabric of his life. On the surface, he had grown into a man, just like everyone else. He went to work, made new friends, and lived a life that looked no different than the others around him. But in his heart, he carried the weight of something far deeper, something that set him apart, though he would never speak of it aloud. The box was always there, a constant reminder of the path he had chosen and the promise he had made. It kept him grounded, even as the years passed and the world continued to turn. And in those quiet moments, when the snow fell outside and the house was wrapped in the stillness of winter, Ethan knew that he had not just become a keeper of worlds, but a keeper of whispers, a guardian of the hidden truths that lived between the lines of reality. And sometimes, just as the night would deepen, Ethan would swear that, if he listened closely enough, he could hear the forest's whispers growing fainter yet more present. The trees, the streams, the glowing light, it was all still there, waiting for him, waiting for the next keeper to arrive. But for now, it was his turn to carry the message forward, to protect the worlds, to listen to the whispers, and to know that one day, when the time was right, he would pass on the wooden box to someone who would carry it just as carefully as he had. And perhaps, on another quiet winter night, they too would hear the forest whispering its gratitude.